When you write your essay about why that school, go back and reread it and make sure that it's not interchangeable with another school.
Why this school or slash the academics essay? This is sort of the next sort of like big kind of like subgroup of supplements. These are going to be a little bit shorter. Okay. These are going to be kind of coming in around 200 to 500 words. But there's a good deal of variation out there. And, one thing I didn't sort of actually show you is that Chicago also has this kind of essay. So it's not like, schools only have like one supplement. Some schools have none, some have one, some have two. And some of the things that we'll be talking about today, you'll actually see them, sort of in a mix in individual schools potentially. But, you might be wondering why we grouped the why the school and the academic questions. And the answer is that honestly, in most cases, there's a lot of overlap between these two types of essays. So with the why the school, you're probably going to be talking specifically about the academic school or program that you're applying to in some way, shape, or form. The majors, the classes you want to be taking, opportunities of research, and other ways to engage academically or in a learning capacity outside of class. And so, that's consistent between the two. But with the why the school, and Michael's going to give us some really interesting kind of insights on this in a minute. But with the why the school, there's always like these non-academic factors, extracurriculars, athletics, campus culture, community careers, et cetera. And what we're going to do is we're going to show you how these guys play out, looking at both Penn, and then we're going to take a look at Duke. So, Michael, I'm going to swing back over to the Common App here and bring us over to Penn, which we've been on this application a few times in our last few sessions. So I always love what you have to say about essays of this ilk. And the way this one's phrased, it says, how did you discover the intellectual and academic interests, and how will you explore them at the University of Pennsylvania? Please respond considering the specific undergraduate school you have selected, 3 to 450, and then there's also a community essay over here for Penn, but let's just focus on this guy right now. Michael, what's sort of like the best practices? How do you advise people on how to approach these?
First of all, the slide that you showed a little while ago, here's a perfect example of how you need to think through how you would use that. Here's an example where one school may say, why our school? And it's the only question. And so in that question, you would talk about some of the other parts of what the school is about and why it would be of interest to you.
Right.
Penn is much more explicit in terms of what they're doing here. Question number one is academic. So you want to talk about what program, what has brought you to the interest in that program. Perhaps, is there a professor at Penn who you've read about and who inspires you? But to be able to put a totally academic spin on the first part of this question that is Penn specific. Mm-hmm. The second part of the question is, what will you bring to the community? What will you share? What kinds of things will you be involved in? So it clearly is, there's a separation in the Penn situation, which is different than a lot of schools that just give you the 650 words to write about everything. The one caution I would give, and not necessarily for Penn, because Penn is much clearer, is that when you write your essay about why that school, go back and reread it and make sure that it's not interchangeable with another school, okay? We talked many times about how you can take things from one essay and move it into another. I had a great episode years ago with the George Washington admissions person. And he basically said that if he could read the essay of why a student wanted to go to George Washington, and it was applicable to both Georgetown and American, then they knew the student hadn't taken the time to really look at why the student wanted to go to George Washington, okay? So keep that in mind in terms of just the why a particular school. Again, Penn does a great job because they actually separate it, okay? In the DC app, you talk about why I love DC, et cetera, et cetera. This doesn't allow you to do this. This is school specific in part one, and then community and activity specific in part two.
What's interesting, Michael, is that as you with the remarks that you're making, I was looking at as I normally do, all the questions that were submitted in the registration before, we sort of got on today. And to be honest, I'd say like 85% of the questions that were submitted were asked about how do you make your why this school application stand out. Would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, but I'm thinking that a lot of it comes back to exactly what you're saying, that you've really dug deeply into the academic offerings and others, but specifically academic offerings at these schools. And it's extremely clear that you really understand what's being offered, why it's different, and why these particular professors, classes, programs, et cetera, work for your sort of like, future self. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. And, in the old days, I hate to use that last year, when students were able to go and visit campuses, they would sit in on classes. They might interact with a professor. They might get a real feel for what the school is like, which they're not able to do right now. I guess what I would encourage students to do is do a little research, perhaps in terms of the professors that teach there. What have they published? What are their specialties? Is it something that really resonates with you? You used the example before of the student, of someone who wants to go into environmental studies and be involved in marine biology. Well, there's some great stuff out there. And you may find out, for example, if you apply to the University of Miami with this phenomenal marine biology program,
Amazing. Yeah.
that there's these guys that have just done this cool stuff that you can really relate to. And then you mention that. It's like, oh my God, I would love to study with Professor so-and-so. He's done such cool work. If I'm an admissions person, I say that kid's done their homework. So to take the time to do that and be school specific is absolutely critical in terms of that piece.
It's interesting too, Michael. I was talking to a student earlier today who, ironically is actually applying to Penn, and we're talking about what you're, sort of commenting on, this idea of engaging professors. To be honest, it might be easier than ever to sit in on classes because they're on Zoom. So for everyone out there who's asking the questions, hopefully you're taking this guidance to heart. There are ways of not just researching, there's also ways of demonstrating your interest and maybe even getting inside some of these classrooms to really understand these schools from the inside. And that may inform or should inform the way you approach these essays. So Michael, Penn gives us 450 words to talk about like why Penn/academics. They give us, another 200 words or so for the community. But if you go over to Duke University, they're giving us similar questions, but they're doing it in, they want it in like 200 words. So Michael, how do you advise people, when they're looking to try to communicate the same idea? How do you do it in like 450 words versus 200 words? Like what's similar, what's different? What do you focus on?
I guess I would use the example of the student who writes their Common App essay draft and gives me 1,000 words, and we have to get it down to 650, okay? So I would take the same approach here in terms of the Duke offering, is that you're going for quality, not quantity. And I think if you read the question in particular, it says, is there something in particular? Okay.
Right.
Read the wording of the question, okay? So you're not going to go into a generality that you might do at a school that lets you have 600 words. You're going to be much more specific in terms of what is there in particular that attracts you to that particular school for that reason. Yeah.
Cool. Now, Michael, moving down over here, we have it's not off topic, it's related, but you have some pretty interesting perspective on these questions from Duke about diversity. And, just to give everyone in the viewing audience some context, for the last couple of years, Duke has effectively had a Why Duke, as well as what we'll call like the diversity essay. But now they have, the diversity essay a bit more broadly, and now they have one over here, diversity and inclusion, specifically related to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. Michael, what are we looking at? Why has it been segmented? And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll give you some real insight. Christoph Gutentag, the Dean of Admissions, actually chatted with me when we included this last question. And I think part of it was a concern in terms of a perception of Duke as a Southern university not being welcoming of students that perhaps, did want to talk about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. It's also an opportunity for a student, and as he and I agreed on this, the parent doesn't necessarily have to ever see the answer to this question. So for a student who's still perhaps closeted, but is thinking that when they get to Duke, they want to be able to have a little bit more comfort in who they are, including this in their essay is a perfect opportunity. The example I used before to you in terms of the first essay is much more community-based, the second essay is much more personally based. Example that I would use is you might talk about Black Lives Matter in the first essay, but then the second essay you might talk about something much more specific to yourself.
Right. You know, we're still in the why this school and the academics sort of bucket or section of our talk here, but you know, we wanted to touch upon these Duke essays because opportunity, and obviously Michael was literally involved in the drafting of this question. So it's just always great to kind of get his perspective on anything. So Michael, thank you.